Let's just jump right into this explainer. I want you to close your eyes for a second. Imagine plunging headfirst into a thick, permanent night. The air around you is incredibly heavy, and it carries this distinct, metallic scent of rusted iron and forgotten prayers. Welcome to Dark Camelot. Now, for any student of the psyche watching, you know this isn't just some fantasy setting, right? It's a profound, almost terrifying clinical case study. Today, we're mapping the total psychological collapse of the ego. We're going to see exactly how a mind shatters and rebuilds itself, all mapped out through this highly stylized, grim, dark, Gothic fable.
Look upon this kingdom, a fortress of the mind built by those who looked into the abyss and blinked. Just think about how perfectly that quote frames our clinical journey here. We aren't exploring a physical castle of stone and mortar. No, we are stepping straight into the architecture of a deeply divided mind. This is a realm built by broken architects, basically internal defense mechanisms that have completely and utterly failed. And right at the very center of this psychological fortress sits a throne that is famously vacant, representing a core identity completely lost to the void.
So, as a student of psychology, you need to recognize what our traveler, who's known here as the Silver Wolf, is actually facing. This is what we call an inverted heroic journey. Instead of going out and slaying external dragons, the traveler is descending inward, straight into the crumbling ruins of their own certainties. Dark Camelot is literally the unconscious mind trapped in a necrotic stasis. It's this mental state where traditional morals and all those classic heroic ideals have just decayed into paralyzing shadows.
Let's move into our first major phase here. Section 1. The threshold of necrotic morality, guarded by the Knight of Memory at the Iron Bridge.
Right at this threshold, we meet the Pale Inquisitor, and his presence is just suffocating. Imagine him raising this heavy, rusted gauntlet to halt our traveler, guarding a grail that he already knows is completely empty. It's fascinating, really. He commands perfect stillness, because in his twisted, necrotic morality, any forward movement, any psychological growth whatsoever is considered a massive threat.
This brilliantly illustrates the paralyzing grip of the past on the human psyche. The Inquisitor wears this silver guilt like a holy garment, right? But he's just using it to cover up his own secret shame, the absolute dread of a hollow heaven. To get past the necrotic stasis of this iron bridge, the traveler's ego has to confront its own guilt head-on. But here's the catch. It has to do it without being completely consumed by the Inquisitor's demand for self-loathing and eternal stillness.
Moving deeper into the keep, we hit Section 2, Nihilism versus Atavism, the diatribe of the failed architects.
As we move further in, the sensory landscape drastically shifts. We leave that rusted iron behind and enter this intense space of cracked stone, shattered glass, and thick, silken webs from the uncanny wood. Here we witness a bitter psychological conflict over that famously vacant throne. It's a stark dialectic breakdown between two radically opposed internal forces. On one side, we have Cynos, the last thinker, a rogue Merlin representing cold logic. On the other side is the Tarantula Preacher, a black knight representing primal atavism and revenge. They are locked in a tense, vicious debate, critiquing the ruins of the mind from their own towers of nihilism and predatory hunger.
Just listen to the sterile, whispering coldness of the thinker for a second. He calls this place a fever dream of a dead king. He says this kingdom is an error in the ledger, and it should not be saved, it should be curated until the final entry is made in my ledger of nothingness. He sits in his glass library, bottling up shadows. To him, the very heartbeat of the traveler, the emotional noise of life, is just an illogical contagion. He doesn't want to heal the psyche at all. He wants to index every single broken vow until they all resolve into a sterile zero. Absolute silence.
Now contrast that cold logic with the guttural predatory hiss of the Tarantula Preacher who's waiting out in the uncanny wood. He mocks the thinker's data rose that cannot bleed. He's actually scraped the gold right off his shield, calling honor a ghost's garment for a king who is also a ghost. He trades the heavy weight of a shield for the lightness of a fang, demanding the traveler embrace the truth of the belly. It's this overwhelming psychological urge to regress, to abandon logic entirely, and let the soul be dragged down into the dark soil of vengeance. Let the silver wolf consume rather than serve.
So how does the mind process this unbearable tension? That brings us to Section 3, the clinical dark awakening, and the introduction of the Obsidian Doctor.
I want you to imagine the heavy, stifling smell of old leather as we introduce the Obsidian Doctor.
He's a Byronic acolyte wearing the terrifying mask of a plague doctor, and he acts as the surgical catalyst for the traveler's internal psychological collapse. See, while the thinker just sits around curating data in a glass tower, the obsidian doctor is actually operating in the trenches of the mind. He's executing the literal clinical pruning necessary to force a brutal transformation beneath the so-called higher men.
Let's break down the mechanics of this transformation. We can literally trace the evolution from a passive servant to the dark gods into something absolutely terrifying. Guided by mercurial energy from the crow, which essentially acts as this subverted, harsh superego, the doctor triggers an atavistic awakening. It's a complete transformation into a humanoid crow wearing a plague doctor mask, becoming a living, agonizing manifestation of the eye that does not turn away. He is completely ready to perform dark surgery on the traveler's soul.
Which leads us directly into Section 4, the labor of the divided soul within the crow's crucible. The final labor is not fought against monsters at the gates, but against the screaming shadow within your own divided soul. Honestly, that quote gives me chills every single time I read it. We have to remember, this isn't just dark fantasy lore. This represents the grueling psychological execution of the ego by its own internal guilt. The final labor isn't external at all. It's the suffocating gloom of fighting that screaming shadow within, all while being guided by the cold, completely detached judgment of the crow.
Look closely at how this subverted superego operates here. It actually takes that ledger of broken vows, the one written in the ashes of the glass library, and weaponizes that internal guilt directly against the traveler. It perfectly mirrors a Herculean struggle, but the labors are entirely psychic and internal. It's violently crushing together memory, reason, and will, forcing the seeker to endure unbelievable psychological torment just to prepare the mind for the violent strike of the violet gavel.
And finally, we arrive at Section 5, the rise of the Byronic Lord and the grave dance in the ruins. Let's trace this entire progression on the timeline and see how it builds. From Hour 1, the initial approach to that hollow, vacant throne, moving into Hour 2, the fracture, where we hit those paralyzing debates of guilt and nihilism. Then, Hour 3 brings the agonizing surgical collapse in the Obsidian Doctor's crucible, and it all culminates in Hour 4. But here's the twist. The traveler doesn't just regress into a mere beast. Instead, there's a dark awakening, a resurrection as the Byronic Lord. You carry the strength to shatter worlds, yet you remain shackled to the guilt of your own creation. In this massive climactic moment of realization, the Byronic Lord looks at the dark round table and finally sees guilt, logic, and revenge for what they truly are: completely broken defense mechanisms. Fully acknowledging that the Grail is empty, the Lord steps way beyond the sterile decay of the past and the predatory hunger of the future.
This grave dance is the ultimate act of psychological rebellion, actively creating new meaning right on top of the shattered remnants of the old psyche. The descent into Dark Camelot is a brutal but totally necessary unwinding of a mind that has lied to itself for far too long. So I'll leave you with this final thought on our clinical case study. When the violet gavel finally falls and your internal world shatters, will you let the shadows consume you, or will you dance in the ruins? Thanks for joining this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the shadows of your own mind.